Well, there you have it. Right there in that gospel reading today is why the Catholic Church does not grant divorce and remarriage, for the very straightforward reason that Jesus said, no, it is not to be done. But we are one of, if not the last denomination of Christianity holding on to the prohibition against divorce and remarriage. And because almost all the other denominations of Christianity are doing it, lots of people look to us and say, you know, come on, Catholics, everybody else is doing it. Why don't you get with the program? Why don't you allow it like all the others do? And honestly, it's the wrong question. The question is not to ask us, why don't we? But the question is to ask them, why do you? There is no doubt about what Jesus said here in the Scriptures. It's absolutely clear. So how do you justify violating what Jesus clearly taught simply because maybe there was a desire for it? It started with Henry VIII in England with the Church of England and his break, and then eventually spread to the other denominations of Protestantism. So we have to ask them, why do you do that? Why do you not understand what Jesus said? And in order to understand it, Jesus says it's adultery. You know, it's actually, there are very few times that Jesus explains moral issues. Usually he lays the foundation and we pick them up from that. But this is one that he clarified because they had great confusion, even among their own scriptures and teachings about it. And so Jesus explained exactly what was going on. When people read the book of Genesis, as we heard in our first reading, they said that since Eve was made from the rib near Adam's side, why did God take the rib? Something close to his heart. Something near his heart was taken away and was built up into the woman, and he longs for it back. So the natural attraction and desire of a man for a woman is not a sin. That is part of God's plan. And people realize in reading there, the two now become one flesh. They realize, well, then if they're joined together as one, they can never be divided. If you take a human being and cut him in half down the middle, what's going to happen to him? He's going to die, no question about it. Can you take one person and cut him down the middle, take another, cut him down the middle, take this half, stick it on that person, sew it up, and say, look, new person? Well, of course not. We can't do that. And people understood from the very beginning in reading the book of Genesis that, well, obviously, if the two have become one body, then nothing can separate them. Only death breaks the bond between them. But that was always a hard thing to accept. And the Lord knows it's hard. God was not commanding us something he didn't realize would be hard for some people. It's also just a further reminder to us that sometimes to follow the Lord means accepting difficult things and changing our lives and living a completely different way. And yes, we do have to sacrifice in order to remain faithful to the Lord. But in Moses' time, they were not ready for that. And there was basically a rebellion going on. And the people they had been rebelling against everything else Moses said, and among them was, if you don't allow us to divorce our wives, we're going to have a revolution here. So Moses, all right, fine. He let them have the divorce, just to keep the peace. And that's what the Pharisees were asking Jesus about today in the gospel reading. May a man divorce his wife? Because there was confusion. The prophet Malachi had even said God hates divorce. And one of the things he railed against them is that the Jewish people, when they came back from the Babylonian captivity, was that you have divorced your wives, and that is something I forbade you to do. So they were confused because they've got scriptures contradicting scriptures. So they asked Jesus, and he finally explains it. Moses buckled in under the pressure and allowed them to have divorce and remarriage. And, of course, we're holding our own. It doesn't look like there's any sign that the Pope is being threatened or tempted to try to change the teaching on divorce and remarriage. And it can't happen, first of all, because it is a clear teaching of the Lord. But imagine, purely theoretically, if somewhere down the line some Pope were to decide to change that because of the pressure and say, okay, we'll allow divorce and remarriage. What would he be doing? He'd still be making Moses' mistake, buckling into the pressure and not teaching what Jesus revealed. Jesus has very strong words on divorce and remarriage. He says anyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. And that, of course, is one of the 10 Commandments, that you shall not commit adultery. And I think we have to remember that God didn't call them 10 suggestions. He called them the 10 Commandments. But I guess we have to still ask ourselves, why does the Lord have to be so tough on us? Why can't he allow it? Sure, there are some situations we've all seen of divorces that were frivolous, that people just didn't give the effort to it that they needed. And the worst example of that I ever read about somewhere in some news article or whatever, a woman who claimed she divorced her husband because he kept leaving the toilet seat up. Now, if that's really the reason why she divorced her husband, we got a problem here with that woman, okay? So sometimes, yes, there are frivolous things. Sometimes things could have been done for a couple to stay together and maybe they didn't try their best. But we all know that there are very difficult cases out there, and we've seen things that break our hearts. People have tried their best, and I've worked with many couples like that, where one has tried for counseling, the other one refuses to go, they don't want to listen, they're not giving their best, or they've tried everything possible, even between the two of them, and there's just nothing left to do. And for the emotional or physical survival of one or both, or the children, they have to separate. Okay, fine. Sometimes we realize a civil divorce is necessary, and sometimes it might even be the right thing to do, because especially if you have the case of a husband who's beating his wife. Well, I don't know a person in the world who's going to say, sorry, he's your husband, you married him, you got to go home and take that. Oh, of course not. You get her out of there. Get the children out, and if you need an order of protection, whatever you do, civil divorce to protect her and the children, fine, then we do that. But a civil divorce is precisely that. In the eyes of the state of New York, or wherever state anyone is residing, it is only in the eyes of the state. It is not in God's eyes. When Jesus says, what God has joined, man must not divide, it literally means man has no power to divide. Man cannot divide. Even the Pope himself has no ability to break a valid sacramental bond. So, when a marriage has, in fact, a sacramental bond has been valid, only the death of one of the parties breaks that bond. But what do you do in those situations? Of course, sometimes, people, once they've got a civil divorce, remember that all that God sees, that judge has no authority over God to break what God has joined. So God simply sees two people who are still married to each other are living in separate houses, which is not a problem necessarily. It's not automatically sinful. In fact, as I said, sometimes it can be the right thing to do. But the marriage continues. And the struggle for somebody who has gone through a divorce that way is, how do I continue to love this person with whom I can no longer live? And that's the challenge in Christ, especially when there are children involved. And one of the biggest dangers I often see with couples who divorce is they trash the other spouse to their children. And I try to remind them, listen, you may have had difficulties and fallen out of love with each other, but your children did not stop loving their mother or their father. And for them to try to win the child over to themselves as siding with them is a horrible thing to do to children. When a husband and wife divorce, the children suffer the most. And sometimes, unfortunately, it does have to be. But again, that's only in the eyes of the state. So let's imagine a scenario. You've got two people, we'll call them Sue and Bob. And Sue and Bob are married, and they end up getting a divorce, and maybe because they need to, because Bob was perhaps abusive of Sue. Okay, so they get a civil divorce. Sue meets Bill, and Sue wants to marry Bill. And she says, he's a better man. He'll be a much more loving father to my children than Bob ever was. She wants to marry him. She goes out and marries him civilly. Well, she's intimate with Bill, but who is her husband before God? It is Bob. So that's why Jesus says it's adultery, because it's violating that bond that was created with the husband and wife the day they were married. And nothing, only death, breaks the bond there. So that's why the Lord is calling us to fidelity in marriage, and also marriage as one of our 7 sacraments is a means by which a man and a woman are called into union with Christ, the means by which his suffering, death, and resurrection are made available very really, very truly present to all of us. And marriage is one of those sacraments, and we speak about marriage being a model of Christ's marriage to the church. That just as Christ has married us and will never divorce us and find another people, neither can a husband or wife divorce each other and just move on to another person. So it is meant to be a bond between two people that lasts as long as they live. And obviously then that means a husband and wife have the duty to make sure they do everything they can to try to keep their marriage firm and in love with each other. And we see many people in our lives who do that. And when we see people well married into their 60 years of marriage or something, we're always very proud of that, because we say, great, I'm sure they all had their difficulties at times, they must have had their fights, but through it all, they work together to keep their marriage together. But then, sometimes, as we said, there are situations that they've just done everything they can. And we look at it and we realize, okay, sure, we can understand why they can't live together anymore. But what happens with them, especially if they're a young couple and still have many years ahead of them and said, I still wanted to raise children and have a family with God? Well, what do we do for them? Again, we can't break the bond. We can't say, well, this bond is broken so that you can marry someone else. Only death breaks the bond. But it is possible to look for an annulment. And an annulment is something that goes all the way back into the Scriptures. In fact, even in Matthew's account of what Jesus says here, he adds the line, unless the marriage was unlawful. And a marriage that was unlawful would mean something had violated the bond from the very beginning. And so, therefore, the bond never, in fact, took place. So when someone petitions for an annulment, what they're saying is we're looking for reason to say that something necessary to create a valid sacramental bond at the time of the marriage was missing. So therefore, the marriage bond never took place, and we're not dissolving it, we're declaring it null and void from the start, that there never was a bond there. Even civil law would speak of the difference between an annulment and a divorce. If we can prove that, then we say there never was a bond, and now the person is free to marry someone else. There has always been cases in history where there would be grounds for annulments, and time doesn't permit us to talk about all of them today. My favorite one that I like to use as an example is what I like to call the soap opera impediment. I don't know how often this happens in real life, but soap operas get a lot of mileage out of it. A young girl and a young man fall in love, and they announce their engagement and everything, and she goes to her father and says, "Daddy, isn't it wonderful? I'm marrying so-and-so." And the father was worried because he had been intimate with the groom-to-be's mother around the time when he was born, and he's afraid it's possible that he might be his son, in which case the two of them can't marry because they're in fact brother and sister. And so they have this whole big thing to look into it, and you get a lot of episodes out of a soap opera out of that. Again, I don't know how many times it happens in real life, but if that did happen and they got married and discovered later that they were actually brother and sister, well, right away it would be null and void, because we'd say there was an impediment to that. You cannot marry your brother or your sister. So even though they went through a wedding and didn't realize this impediment, nevertheless it was there. And there were many others that could be quoted in the past, but they were usually rare. In the 1970s, the church understood something different about our world. First of all, with the understanding of marriage changing in the modern world, there were lots of even faithful Catholics who were getting married who did not understand the nature of the sacramental bond of marriage as one of our sacraments, and they were entering a Catholic marriage without a Catholic understanding of marriage, and they were never, in fact, intending what the Catholic Church teaches marriage to be. So one of the things we've done to try to avoid that is the pre-Cana programs that we have to try to let people know this is what we expect a marriage to be, which is very different from what the world out there often says marriage is. And then the church realized that some people lacked due discretion. Maybe it was they were too immature, they didn't realize what they were doing, they rushed into something, or they were not emotionally stable enough to give themselves completely to another person in that bond. So the fact that they lacked due discretion, or there was pressure on them for anything, a fear of if I don't marry this person, who will marry me, that type thing. Well, if there's anything like that, then the church says if those cases are there, we can declare the marriage null and void. And that is the grounds on which most annulments are given today, that the person, one or the other, lacked due discretion to truly enter into the sacramental bond. And when that happens, if the church can prove that, then the first marriage is declared null and void, and the person may now marry somebody else sacramentally in the church, raise children and raise a family to that. And I've worked with many couples over the years that I've helped get an annulment, and they were able to marry in the church and then go forth and have the beautiful sacramental marriage that they realized they got married on frivolously when they were very young and didn't think it through, and it didn't work out. And now they're able to validly marry in the church because their first marriage, the bond was not dissolved, it was declared null and void. And so, that is the solution that the church does have. And many of the cases of marriages that have ended in divorce may in fact be null and void, and maybe that's one of the reasons why they ended in divorce, was because they were null and void from the beginning. And so if anyone here or somebody you know and love is in that situation, has gone through a divorce and would like to marry sacramentally and raise children especially, or whatever it may be, encourage them to look at the annulment proceedings. Unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation about annulments out there that we're constantly trying to dispel. And just to mention a couple of them, first, I've heard people say, well, you can only get an annulment if you were married less than a year. Nonsense. We could declare marriages null and void posthumously if we had to. Or, well, you can't get an annulment if you had children. Again, not true. Whether or not children were born of the marriage has nothing to do with whether or not the marriage was null and void from the beginning. Or the other thing people say, well, if you do get an annulment, then your children are considered illegitimate, or they use the other word for it. Again, not true. Any child born out of a marriage that was assumed valid at the time, that's called a putative marriage, and that child is considered perfectly legitimate. And in canon law today, there are absolutely no impediments left for somebody being born outside of lawful wedlock. So it's really a moot point. And the other one that some people use that really gets me angry is when they say, well, if you have enough money, you can get the divorce, the annulment, but if you don't, forget about it. That is viciously false. That is usually said by people who have an axe to grind against the church for some reason and are telling people a lie such as that would keep people from going through the very process that might give them the healing and the situation that can settle their difficulty and allow them to validly marry this person they now want to marry before the Lord. Under no circumstances whatsoever is anyone ever turned away because they can't afford the annulment process. And whether or not a person can afford to pay their portion of it, and it's only a portion of the process. The church absorbs 2/3 of it. But the inability to pay has no effect whatsoever on the outcome of the divorce, of the annulment, rather. And so if you hear anybody saying that, very politely remind them or let them know that they don't know what they're talking about. That is absolutely false. On our parish website, I have put a link there for FAQs, frequently asked questions about annulments, and even the link to how to start the annulment process. You download the paperwork there, and then a priest in the parish sees it, works with you, and submits it. Yeah, it can be time-consuming because there's a lot of paperwork involved with it, but my friends, it's well worth the effort, especially if you wish to marry validly in church. So, no, we cannot break a sacramental bond. Only death does that. Jesus clearly teaches that to us. But if there has been a case where somebody has gone through a divorce and would like to validly marry in the church, please encourage them to come and look for an annulment. Come and speak to one of us. We'll be happy to do everything we can to help you to remain faithful to the promises that were made in marriage and be able to validly marry in the beautiful and wonderful and bond of marriage with its indissoluble bond, a bond that is only broken by the death of one of the partners. Please, if you or someone you know needs help, by all means, let them come and see us. We'll do everything we can to help them. May Jesus Christ be praised, now and forever.